So, so I asked Ted to send me a bio, and it's pretty impressive. So even though
You don't
I
have to read it all. You can hit the highlights, just the bare
well,
minimum. Yeah.
sorry. Ted Merwin serves as the senior writer for the Jewish Federations of North America, JEFNA, the umbrella organization for 146 federations in the United States and Canada. And when we're done, I want to say a quick word about JEFNA. Before coming to JEFNA, he taught religion and Judaic studies for 16 years at Dickinson College, my alma mater, which is how kind of we got put together, where he also was the Hillel director at the Milton Asbel Center for Jewish Life. He's the author of two books, In Their Own Image, New York Jews in the Jazz Age, Popular Culture, and the National Jewish Award-winning Pastrami on Rye, An Overstuffed History of the Jewish Deli. His articles on Jewish culture have appeared in Newsweek, New York Times, New York Daily News, New York Post, Washington Post, Haaretz, Hadassah, and many other newspapers and magazines. Also served for 19 years as theater critic for the New York Jewish Week. Speaks regularly coast to coast, so he's on the East Coast. So he's literally speaking coast to coast tonight, drawing on his extensive collection of Jewish food-related memorabilia, including neon signs and light-up clocks from delis in both Chicago and New York. So just before we begin, first of all, here's a copy of the book, and I'm happy to lend it to anybody once I'm done with it. It's genuine scholarly history, but reads quite smoothly. And just in case, somebody characterized Riverside, Jewishly speaking, as an island, and what that means is, we're a nice, solid, historically grounded Jewish community, synagogue, but we're not in any federated community, not not Los Angeles. There are a couple of small ones not too far from us, and not even in those. And so perhaps it bypasses us. The importance of Jeffna bypasses us. But like you said, it's 146 communities. The last I heard, it raises, and I could be wrong about this. It's hard to hear. I'm not. I don't know what to do about that. I can hear Ted when he speaks. I made it as loud as I can. Maybe you can make it as loud as you can on your computer. But the Federation raises, the last I heard, in the neighborhood of $1.5 billion a year to distribute both domestically and internationally, including a significant amount that goes to the Jewish Agency.
My picture went away and it's your picture now.
Okay. All right. So I heard a couple of people speaking. I apologize for the hemming and hawing, but I did want to mention Federation. Betsy worked in North Carolina for, what is it, 12 or 13 years in the Federation building in Greensboro, North Carolina. I ran a Hillel for 6 years, for which we received a very big grant every year from Hillel. And I was also the director of a community Hebrew high school in Worcester, Mass.
Yes, it could be louder.
Which also got a very nice grant from the local federation. I will ask you to mute yourselves, please, as I turn the floor over to our speaker, Ted Merwin. It's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Phil, or Rabbi Cohen. I really appreciate the invitation. It was really wonderful to get back in touch with you fairly recently after not being in touch for so long. But I definitely remember very vividly our conversations that you had when you came back to visit Dickinson. And I wanted to, I'm thinking about a number of things tonight. I'm thinking about obviously everything that's kind of going on in our world right now. And the rabbi and I were just talking about how, unfortunately, the history of American Jewish life to some extent is sort of the history of anti-Semitism in America. So I will try to work that in a little bit tonight. I'm thinking about Passover, and I will definitely be able to work that in. And I'm also just thinking about how I actually started on this whole project while I was working at Dickinson. And my wife, who is the coordinator of Jewish studies at Dickinson and has been for 25 years now, came back to came home after a meeting that she had been to with the president of the college. I mean, this was like 20 years ago, and so I don't know, other than Rabbi Cohen, if any of you have been to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's a small town in South Central PA, near Harrisburg, Hershey, those kinds of places. And the president at the time was looking for ways to really integrate the life of the campus into the life of the surrounding community. And Dickinson has its own bookstore, coffee shop, that kind of thing. And so students weren't really going into the town that often and interacting with the townspeople, spending money in the local businesses and that kind of thing. And so he was trying to rectify that. He was trying to find ways to kind of bring the two closer together. And so he talked about this concept, which she had never heard of and I had never heard of, which was developed by a sociologist in Florida named Ray Oldenburg, which is called the third place. The third place is sort of neither home nor work, but kind of where people go to hang out in a very relaxed way with people who are not necessarily their closest family or friends or anything like that, and have the kinds of conversations and the kind of interactions that Oldenburg, sort of theorized are really indispensable to a healthy democracy. And so there are a number of different, if you think about different ethnic groups, you think about different kinds of third places for different groups, right? You think about, for example, for the Irish who came to America, right? Obviously the Irish pub, the place where they drank together, basically. When you think about, say, Italians, you think about, if you know the history about Italian immigration, Italians had what were called social clubs, where they would get together and play cards and play bocce and cook pasta and whatever, in their kind of sort of very relaxed and convivial way. African Americans had barbershops and beauty parlors, and Jews had delis. I mean, the deli really was the kind of third place in Jewish life. So that's going to be a major theme about what I'm talking about tonight. And one of the things that for me is really sort of instructive about the history of the Jewish deli is it makes us reflect on what are those kinds of places for us today? To what extent do we have those kinds of social spaces where Jewish people can get together from different backgrounds, maybe from different levels of religious observance, and be able to create that kind of, sort of vibrant Jewish life. So I want to start, though, as I mentioned, with so on page 5 of my book, very, very quickly, I talk about the first recorded sandwich in history. And does anybody know? Actually, I don't know if anybody wants to unmute themselves for a second or put in the chat. Does anyone know what the first sandwich in recorded history was? I don't know about a trick question, but
I assume it was in Great Britain.
okay, that's what a lot of people think. That's that's sort of like
The Earl of Sandwich, right?
yes, in the 18th century. But think about the holiday we just celebrated a couple of days ago.
Right. Okay.
That was long before the Earl of Sandwich in the late 18th century, right? So I'll just read very quickly from my book. A rabbi named Hillel the Elder, who lived during the time of King Herod and the Roman Emperor Augustus, devised a creative way to fulfill the injunction in the Torah that the Israelites should eat matzah and bitter herbs to commemorate their enslavement to the Egyptian pharaohs. He enclosed the herbs along with a goodly portion of paschal lamb, because the original Hillel sandwich was included the meat from the sacrifice, the temple sacrifice. He enclosed the herbs along with a goodly portion of paschal lamb inside the bread, making what we would call today a wrap. And so it probably wasn't matzah, right? Because when you think about it, a wrap, matzah wouldn't work; it would crumble to pieces. So it was probably more like a I say here, thick, soft, chewy, flat bread, like perhaps Indian roti, Mediterranean pita, Mexican tortilla, or Middle Eastern lavash. Hillel dubbed his innovation the korech, basing it on the ancient Hebrew word likarech, which means to circle or envelop. It was a term that was also used to refer to a book binding or to a funeral shroud. And then I talk about the modern, the modern word sandwich in 1773, named after John Montague, the fourth Earl of Sandwich. Okay, so there's definitely a connection between Passover and the history of the sandwich and the history of the Jewish deli. No question about it. The other thing is that I always think about Passover in connection with this book and with this whole sort of meaning for me of Jewish delis, because I grew up in a very secular Jewish family. I grew up actually with very little knowledge of Judaism, very little involvement, really no involvement in the Jewish community. I mean, I grew up in Great Neck, New York, which was a very Jewish suburb at the time. But my family was very secular. They didn't belong to a synagogue. I didn't have a bar mitzvah when I was 13 years old. I ended up having one later when I was in college, which is one of the reasons I think I was really drawn to Hillel work, because I saw how powerful it is for people of that age to kind of discover Judaism for the first time or really develop their Jewish identity, because it didn't happen for me at all until I was in college. But I did have a kind of cultural, I guess you would say, connection to Judaism that came largely from my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, who lived. Is anyone here from New York? Raise your hand if anybody is from New York originally. Okay, Ronald says yes. Where are you from? What borough? You're muted, so you have to unmute first.
I'm from upstate Albany.
Oh, you're from Albany. Oh, so you're not from New York
Yes.
City. You're from New York State. Okay, very, very good. So my family was all from New York City, and somebody's raising their hand, but I have no idea who they are because their screen is completely blank. So
Hello.
oh,
Yeah, I am from Long Beach, from Long Island. Yeah.
okay. So you're also a Long Island person, and you're muted. Who's raising your hand? You okay?
I'm Joan, and I'm from Hempstead. And
Hempstead.
I have aunts and uncles that lived in Great Neck.
Oh, so we have a lot of people from not
Yeah.
just from New York, but from Long Island.
My
Okay.
husband he grew up in Manhattan.
Okay, very good. Okay, good. So you know what you have some idea of what I'm talking about. So so my grandparents would come over on, the weekends. They lived in Flushing, which is in Queens,
Yeah.
from Long Island. I was right across the border, basically, into New York City. And my grandparents ate only like traditional Eastern European Jewish food. I never saw them eat a slice of pizza or an egg roll or anything like that in their entire lives. And they lived my grandmother into her 80s, my grandfather into his 90s. So so we had to get the food that we weren't eating, we were eating whatever, I mean, we weren't keeping kosher, we weren't whatever. So we would get food from a deli around the corner, and it was always the same order. I was the one who would be sent around the corner to bring back the food. It was always pound of turkey, pound of roast beef, a dozen slices of the seeded rye bread, which I'm sorry to mention on Passover, but it was rye bread, and Heinz baked beans and a little container of gravy, whatever. And I would come around the corner. My mother still lives in the same house. She's in her late 80s. She still lives in the same house that I grew up in. And I would come inside, and we had, like a round kitchen table. I would put the food down on the table, and I swear, within 5 minutes, there was not a morsel, a speck, a tiniest piece of food of it, right? And so the reason I think about this with Passover is because we were studying, we were sort of almost kind of like reenacting a little bit the 10 plagues, right, as part of the Passover Seder. And if you remember the plague of the locusts, remember they come in and they sort of like devour everything in sight. That was my family. There was something about this food, there was something about this, like, it was this connection to Yiddishkeit, to Judaism. And, I was telling this story at one point, and somebody said, this story is actually very ironic. And I said, what's ironic about it? It's just the way that I grew up, and they said, well, you said that, like you would eat turkey, pound of turkey, pound of roast beef. They were like, most Jews didn't go to the deli to get turkey or roast beef, that wasn't the thing. That wasn't like the really Jewish meats that you would get from the deli, like you were actually doing something that was much more Americanized than you even realized. you were sort of doing something Jewish in in a very American context. And that was very, very helpful to me, actually, that that person said that, because it made me realize how much of a theme that I was wrestling with in terms of writing this book about, like how Jewish and how American was the deli. And that was part of what I wanted to research. Like, for example, were there delis in Eastern Europe, or were delis basically invented in the United States? I mean, I have in the book, I have a few little examples, but for the most part, there really weren't a lot of delis in Eastern Europe. They really became a feature of life in New York and then in other places where Jews migrated. All right, so I think that's enough of an intro. Let me share my screen and let me, okay, can everybody see? I need to go to share my sound just to make sure that I do that. And then I also need to go to the slideshow. Okay, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yes.
This is from Katz's. Has anyone been to Katz's
Yes.
Street? Okay, good. On Houston Street. It's still there in New York on the Lower East Side. Okay. And I was just saying, like, what were the meats that Jews would eat when they would go to the deli? What do we have here? Can anybody?
Corned beef.
We got on the
Beef,
left.
pastrami. The
Left
other one is like plain
pastrami.
roast beef.
I think on the right is brisket.
Where's the salami?
There's no salami here.
No,
Oh,
but
okay.
corned beef.
Corned beef pastrami, but actually not corned beef pastrami and roast beef or brisket. But what were actually the three? It's not in this picture. What were the three really truly classic? Corned beef pastrami, and what was the third one? Anybody know?
Salami?
Nope.
Corned beef. Tongue.
Tongue.
For
Tongue.
now,
This is my grandmother loved tongue. I mean, every time I
Yeah.
enjoyed it too.
ordered tongue, and and we never, my sister and I just like we could not understand how somebody could actually eat, you
Yeah.
know. But actually, when I thought about it later on when I was working on the book, it was actually really, interesting to me because my grandmother grew up with parents who spoke only Yiddish, and her mother lived with them while my mother was growing up. So my mother told stories about her grandmother not speaking English, only speaking Yiddish. And Yiddish is, we call the mama lashon, right? The mother's
Under
tongue,
tongue.
kind
Yeah.
of thing. Yeah. And so, but my grandmother would occasionally, she would sort of sprinkle, her conversation with a Yiddish word, and I wouldn't understand what she was saying, and she would have this look on her face. It would be so disappointed, like, what's the matter? You don't know Jewish, because Yiddish is Jewish. And it was almost like if you don't know Jewish, you can't be Jewish. Like, how could you not know? But like, how could I know? Like, I wasn't growing up with it. So I don't know. This whole thing about tongue and whatever, I think is really interesting. All right, so let's see. Maybe I can play a little clip to illustrate this. Because tongue is not really. It's hard to find it nowadays in delis. Actually, in Southern California, there's a lot of tongue, but it's not eaten by Jews as much, but by Mexican Americans. They love to eat
Yeah, that's right.
a lot of tongue in Southern California.
What do they call it? Lengua.
I was in a kosher deli,
Here.
it was just the other day, when an old man called the waiter, and I overheard him say, I'm looking at the menu and the specials on the wall, and I can't find a thing to eat, 'cause there's no tongue at all. You've got turkey and pastrami, you've got latkes and salami, you've got pickled peppers packed in jars and crocks. You've got gribbenes and knishes and a zillion kinds of fishes, I see whitefish, sable, cisco, carp, and lox. You've got borscht and eggs and knockers pressed by all the alta cockers. You've got kishke, helzel, fricassee, and lamb. You got gefilte fish and grain. You got seltzeltjes and plain. So how come you don't have tongue?
I will, if I can later. That's Shelley Posen. He is a wonderful folk singer up in Canada, and he did this whole album of Jewish food songs about 20 years ago, and I can just listen to them over and over. If I have time, I'll play another one by him. Anyway, so let's just talk quickly about, okay, this is Jewish deli, as I mentioned, it really kind of comes into its own
Carnegie, I've been there.
in New York. Yeah, a lot of these places have closed now. Carnegie is gone. The Stage Deli is gone. They're almost all, are gone now. But actually, I mean, the sort of assumption that I made when I first started doing the research for my book was that Lower East Side period, that Jews came to the United States in really large numbers, starting in 1881 with the assassination of the Tsar, of Alexander II in Russia, which was blamed on the Jews, even though they had nothing to do with it. And then up through the 1920s, 1924, really, when the United States Congress basically shuts off immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. So you have a couple of million Jews who are coming to the United States during that period. So, and the Lower East Side becomes incredibly crowded, like some people say the most crowded place on the face of the earth during the time. And so I assume that was the period that the deli really kind of came in, was at its height. And I found out that there were actually not that many delis during that immigrant time period. Jews didn't have the disposable income to be buying food. Plus, I mean, for Jews who kept kosher, they didn't have these kosher symbols or kosher certifying agencies that we have now. So we can talk more about this if people are interested. But I think there are a number of reasons why the deli actually didn't come into its own during that immigrant period. It was really a later decade, which we'll get into in a few minutes, when the deli really becomes just an integral part of the sort of landscape or foodscape, of New York. So this is Katz's again. I think this actually, one of the things I love about this image is I think it really speaks to what I was just saying earlier, this sort of notion of the third place, because you kind of have that. I mean, you have like the employees of the deli, but you also have like the cop on the right, and you have the guy who looks like a gangster, looks like Al Capone or something, who's second from the left, and it's like you have the sense of sort of the neighborhood kind of gathering. So when I think about this notion of the deli as a gathering place, kind of par excellence for the Jewish community, I really think about a particular theme song of a sitcom, one of the most popular theme songs. Anyone have any ideas about what I'm talking about? That sort of speaks to this notion of people.
Cheers.
Maybe
Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Cheers. Cheers.
Sometimes you wanna go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. You wanna be where you can see our troubles are all the same. You wanna be where everybody knows your name.
Okay, so the song written by Gary Portnoy and Judy Hart Angeles, and Gary Portnoy is Jewish, and obviously the show, if anybody's familiar with Cheers, it's been a few decades since the show was on, but now everything's, you can watch pretty much anything now. And so I reached out to him and I was like, I know this song was about a bar in Boston, this show was about a bar in Boston, so on its face the song has nothing to do with Jewish delis, but you're Jewish and maybe you were subconsciously thinking about delis when you were writing it. And he said, no, of course not. And I said, well, did you grow up going to delis? And he said, yeah. He said, actually, you grew up in Brooklyn, then they moved to Long Island at some point when he was young. And he said Sunday nights we would pile into the station wagon. Do you remember when we had station wagons? That's been a while. And we would all go into the city to go to Katz's and have dinner. And I said, Gary, you were thinking about Jewish delis, whether you knew it or not. I don't know. So, all right, let's keep moving here. So one of the things to emphasize is that in terms of the deli's place in not just Jewish culture, but sort of as an icon, as an emblem of New York culture, right? Like that, if you're going to visit New York, you have, this is like kind of an iconic experience of New York, is eating in a deli. You can't really go to New York without, that's the way it used to be. It's not that way anymore because the delis have faded out for the most part. But, this is from Look magazine from 1970, I believe. And sort of an interesting idea about what is the real thing here? What's the authentic symbol of New York? Is the cab driver, in the yellow cab? Is it the Is it the bottle of Coke, which obviously it's what it's an ad for. But actually in the foreground is the corned beef sandwich, right? And it sort of gives you that impression that like, this is the most authentic symbol of the city. Or here, Carnegie Deli sandwich being sort of worth its weight in gold. This is when New York was competing against London and Madrid and all these other cities to host the 2012 Summer Olympics. Okay, we're going to keep moving. And so, as I said, there actually weren't a lot of delis in Eastern Europe. There were delis in Germany. The word delicatessen actually comes from the stores in Germany that sold fancy imported gourmet foods. And so you can go to Germany even today, and you can shop at a place that's been around for hundreds of years. I actually have never been to Germany. It's one place I really want to be able to visit. But what I think of it, if you've ever been to the food hall at Harrods in London, and
Yes.
a lot of people have been there. And it's just food from all over the world. I mean, it's just like incredible sort of array of all different kinds of food. So, okay, but delis come to New York really before Jews do. I mean, or before the big wave of Jewish immigration I mentioned, the German delicatessen is already kind of a feature of New York life before the Jewish delicatessen becomes one. And there were German Jews who were among the huge wave of Germans who came to in the middle of the 19th century. But I think this concept of the Jewish deli develops when you have this huge influx of Jews, and I think these delis are during this period pretty much kosher delis, right? It's not clear how they started. Nobody knows whose was like the first deli. It may have been an offshoot of the kosher sausage companies like Isaac Gellis, which was on Essex Street, as you see here on the Lower East Side. It may have been a butcher shop. They started selling a little bit of prepared foods on the side. But we really don't know. But we do know that, certainly in the 1880s, 1890s, there were delis that were popping up. There were just not that many of them. I mean, there was a survey done in 1899 of the 10th ward of the Lower East Side, which was like the Jewish Lower East Side, Orchard Street, Essex Street, Hester Street, Christie Street, and so on. There were 10 delicatessens that they found in that survey, and 10 sausage stores, which were called Wurstgeschäften in Yiddish. But still, we're talking what? Even if we say 20, there were literally hundreds of thousands of Jews living in that neighborhood during that time. So either they had very, very long lines for Sunday brunch, or people were not eating at delis all that much, right? I mean, I'm joking about like eating in delis, because actually the other kind of misconception a lot of people have is that the delicatessen started out the way we think of it now, as a restaurant, as a place for people to eat, in the place. That wasn't true. I mean, it was like what I was saying a moment ago about Germany and London and other places, right? That it was a takeout store. It was a delicatessen store. And when I started doing the research, I was going through like hundreds and hundreds of articles in the New York Times and other newspapers. The word delicatessen never appeared by itself. It was always delicatessen store, because that's what it was. It was a takeout place. And then at some point, after the turn of the 20th century, and here this is not New York, but Philadelphia, you see that you start to have, if you look maybe half a dozen lines down over where the address is, where it says, okay, so sandwiches and hot frankfurters at all hours, also fine lunchroom. Why would they need to say that if it weren't like something that people couldn't take for granted, right? If they thought of it as basically a takeout store. But now it's a place where people can go and have lunch. Okay, I am gonna move fairly quickly here. And these are delis that, I mean, part of what has been really fun for me about this project, and I'm still doing it, is collecting stuff. So collecting things on eBay, as the rabbi mentioned. Obviously, the neon signs and whatever are my favorite, but also just collecting a lot of menus and a lot of great photos and stuff like that. So this is from East Harlem from the early 1920s. And this is from Brooklyn from actually, I think, the 1950s. And as I mentioned, menus, right? Menus are really, really useful for food historians like me. I'm always really interested in the menu covers in particular. What is the kind of self-image of the establishment? What is the way in which, how do customers who are eating in a deli want to sort of see themselves? So for example, in the book, I don't have it in the presentation, but in my book, I have a picture of a couple who are very elegantly dressed, and they're sitting in a deli, and there's like a fern, that's sort of overhanging the table, and there's a waiter in a tuxedo who's bringing a silver chafing dish, and he's going to take off the top of the chafing dish. And this is very common. I mean, you see this in, on matchbooks, and it's a very common motif. Like, and it's bizarre. It makes absolutely no sense. People aren't going to delis as like 4-star fine dining experiences, right? They're going to have like a sandwich. They're going to eat with their hands, right? Like the whole thing about the deli is really interesting because it was such a relaxed kind of environment, and which makes sense because Jews were so there was so much prejudice against Jews. Jews were stereotyped as being vulgar, right? As being uncouth, as being anything but genteel, right? Gentile. There was so much there were so many negative perceptions of Jews as being like not really kind of ready for prime time, in terms of not really being, knowing how to comport themselves. And the deli was a place where they can kind of let down their hair, and like, I mean, there's something very primitive about eating with your hands. You don't need table manners. You don't need like cutlery. You don't whatever, right? And so I always find it really ironic that like at the same time as Jews were eating in these places, which was all about this very, relaxed type of style of eating, they still wanted to see themselves as upwardly mobile, as sophisticated, as really kind of like having some kind of really high class dining experience. I wish I brought in a slide that specifically speaks to that, but I'm sure you can kind of get it from my description. This is obviously, if we have fans of Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, this is the Stage Deli, right? That's a very common location in the show. Okay, so as far as the menu covers. So a lot of the menu covers, as I was showing here, right, had caricatures of the stage and screen stars of the day. This is 1920s. So 1920s, the theater district in New York has moved up basically from Herald Square to Times Square, and the deli becomes sort of like the hangout for the show business folk. The actors, the directors, the composers, the stage managers, and the customers as well, right? So there's something really, my PhD is in theater, so like this is my thing, is like, the convergences between like the Jewish food of the time and the Jewish entertainment culture writ large of the time. And the film industry, the silent film industry is based in New York at this point. It hasn't moved to Hollywood. It's sort of in the process of moving to Hollywood, but it's basically in New York. And you have huge movie palaces also in New York where people are going to the movies at least once a week. It's like a religion almost unto itself. Huge, fancy, like, parades of uniformed ushers and fountains, and like, going to the movies is like really, really exciting. It's like going to Radio City Music Hall or something like that, right? Is going to the movies. These movie palaces, right? They were called movie palaces. So the Broadway theaters, which are spectacular and whatever, and also 1920s, there were literally hundreds. Like 1927, there were 200 and something shows that opened on Broadway in that year. Which is unbelievable. Now maybe 20 shows open on Broadway a year, right? And they all cost like, however many tens of millions of dollars to produce. But in this period, like during the season, there might be 3 shows opening on Broadway every night. I don't know where they fit them all. So I'm just trying to convey like how active the entertainment world was at that point. So, and the deli was a very important part of it. So Harpo Marx, for example, he and his brothers became famous performing vaudeville all over the country. But they were from New York. They're from East Harlem. And, he said, I'd love coming back to New York. Whenever we came back to New York, he said, I had 2 homes away from home, Lindy's and Rubens. He said, right, the 2 most famous delis of the day. right? He said, these were places where I found my people speaking my language with my accent. And which is funny because Harpo Marx didn't speak, I mean, in any of his movies, right? And I have yet to find a YouTube or any kind of an interview with him. If anybody can find one, I would love it, because I would love to hear what his voice actually sounded like. But he has this autobiography called Harpo Speaks, and he has that line that I just quoted. So, and these were places that were not kosher by any means. They sold all different kinds of food, very high class, you know, chops and steaks and lobsters and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And they also sold deli sandwiches. And you can see by the menu, right? You can see by the menu cover how much of the celebrity culture was a part of the experience of going to the delis. Not only that, but if you've ever been, people were saying that they've been to the Carnegie or they've been to the stage, right? You know, where the walls were plastered with pictures of the luminaries of the day. And by the way, not just actors and people who are like actually showbiz people, but people like Walter Winchell, the gossip columnist, the gangsters, the Jewish gangsters, right? Um, I mean, people who are famous, infamous, or whatever. And the sandwiches themselves were named after the stars of the day, right? I mean, you know, so you would eat like the Eddie Cantor or the Al Jolson or the Al Jolson. He performed at the Winter Garden Theater on Broadway, and he would invite the entire audience to come back to Lindy's to have a sandwich with him. And I'm sure people did it. You know, it was like that was the kind of relationship that people had in those days. Like there was a much closer sort of like relationship that I mean, people would like they'd wait outside the stage door when Eddie Cantor was performing, and they bring him soup and they bring him whatever because they, you know, like, you know, he had that persona of being like this little boy or whatever who, you know, was very naive and things like that. So, and then there was also, I mean, I wish I had time to go into all of these different aspects, but there was also this very strange, very interesting dynamic that obtained between the waiter and the customer in these Jewish delis, and also in some dairy restaurants like Ratner's on Delancey Street on the Lower East Side, where the waiter would like insult the customers and tell them where to sit and tell them what to eat and make fun of them and, you know, like order them around and stuff like that, and sort of try to belittle and humiliate them a little bit. Very weird, you know, but also like I think it came from talk about like this idea of upward mobility, right? Jews eating in these delis, having this kind of vicarious experience of celebrity at a time when there was so much anti-Semitism in American society. The rabbi and I were talking about this earlier. 1920s was the most anti-Semitic decade in the 20th century, largely because of figures like you mentioned Charles Coughlin, but also Henry Ford was probably the most prominent anti-Semite from the 1920s. And so, you know, I think Jews were sort of, I mean, they weren't really accepted. We weren't really accepted yet in American society. But I think the deli was a place where we could sort of fantasize about having that level of acceptance and eating these, you know, like huge overstuffed sandwiches, you know, like the idea being, I mean, you know, in Eastern Europe, Jews like barely ate meat ever, right? I mean, chicken maybe occasionally, right? But beef almost never. I mean, most of them were really, really, really poor. So I think there was still some of that remained after they came to America, this idea that like meat as a symbol of luxury, you know, as a symbol maybe of the American dream, to be able to eat these huge overstuffed, you know, pastrami or corned beef sandwiches, right? Was like, you know, like we made it, you know, kind of thing, even though I just said they didn't yet, right? I mean, really, really interesting kind of dynamic about what was happening. So, all right, I showed this. Oh, I wanted to say, so for the Carnegie, interesting, they don't have caricatures of stars on the menu. They have landmarks of New York. So as if like the Carnegie Deli is on the same level of importance, right, as like, you know, Radio City Music Hall or Carnegie Hall or Madison Square Garden or whatever. And I think that's interesting too. Actually, I was once on an airplane to Paris, and I was reading the Air France in-flight magazine, and it was a whole section about New York, like what to do when you come to New York as a tourist. And it said the first thing to do in New York when you land at, I don't think it said Idlewild. Idlewild was before my time. JFK. When you land at JFK, is to make a beeline for the Carnegie Deli, the temple of Jewish gastronomy, right? So lots of stuff are interesting in that. I mean, part of it is like, don't miss that. That's the first thing you need to do. Of everything that you could do in New York, right, is to go to the Carnegie Deli. But also this religious language, kind of particularly for Jews who are, I mean, I think it resonated. That wasn't specifically for a Jewish audience, but I think it probably resonated in particular with Jews who were becoming more secular during this period. Because 1920s is when there's a huge sort of like drop off in Jews belonging to synagogues, Jews keeping kosher, and so on in New York. As Jews are just sort of on the verge of becoming a little more acculturated, a little more assimilated into American society, you start to have the development of a more secular Jewish identity. And so the deli sort of substitutes in a way for that. I mean, that's the way I talk about in my book. Like the deli is sort of like a surrogate synagogue, a substitute synagogue, that kind of language. That, I mean, I may be overdoing it a little bit, but I don't think that much. I think that it really does become sort of a way for Jews to maintain a lot of those kind of ethnic connections, but without a lot of what they consider to be like kind of the religious baggage. All right, we're gonna run out of time if I don't keep moving here. So, all right. Okay, I focus in my research mostly on New York and on Chicago. And I don't know if do we have anybody from Chicagoland who's here? Chicago is fascinating to me because in some ways Chicago is just as important, if not more important, than New York in the development of the deli, because Chicago is where all the meat was processed, right? It's where all the stockyards were. And so the sausage companies that develop in Chicago are the ones who end up really, becoming the main purveyors of delicatessen meats to the South and to the West. So from California, there's this kind of, it's always like looking east to Jerusalem, right? Like when we pray, we look east to Jerusalem. From Chicago, to some extent, they were looking to New York. From California, they were looking to Chicago, to New York, to Jerusalem, in terms of all this kind of, Jewish culture and things like that. Okay. So I'm just going to play. How much time do I have, Rabbi? Because I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, you got some flexibility. I mean, I would, I would stop in 10, 15 minutes and take questions.
Okay, 10, 15 minutes. Okay. All right. All right. So one of the themes that comes up for me a lot, particularly when I'm talking about New York and Chicago, not so much maybe in terms of LA or California, is the connections between Blacks and Jews in the deli. This is sort of a whole other theme that we haven't even touched on yet. I mean, I'm very interested in kind of non-Jewish interest in Jewish culture. At one point, I even started writing a book that I ended up kind of abandoning about non-Jewish sort of appropriation of Jewish culture. And oh, wait, I have to make sure I plug in my computer. 1 second. I'd see that the thing fell out. So I actually spent one Passover week, like this one. It was actually Holy Week also that year, traveling from Dallas Fort Worth all the way down to now I'm blanking on it. What's the it's in South Texas?
Galveston?
Not Galveston. No. Anyway, I went to 3 different seders in Texas, Christian seders in Texas. No, I'm talking about where Kufi is, the Christian that Christian Zionist group. There's a church there. Pastor John Hagee.
Yeah. I don't know where it's located. You mean Houston?
I don't know. I'm blanking on the name
San
of the town.
Antonio?
Thank you. I knew it. I just like, yeah. Thank you. Right, San Antonio. Anyway, I went to 3 different seders in 1 week. They were Christian seders because I wanted to see and the one in San Antonio was like blew my mind. I mean, there's 500 non-Jewish people and it incorporated every symbol you could imagine, not just from Passover, but like they blew the shofar and they danced the hora and it was like everything all in one. I mean, it was so ecstatic. It was like I've never seen people have such a good time on Passover. It was fascinating. Anyway, because I wanted to write a book about this and about Christian Zionism and I was really interested in the whole phenomenon of non-Jewish women who are married to Jewish men who are raising Jewish children. There was this whole thing called the Mother Circle for a long time. I don't know if it still exists. This is an organization which helps non-Jewish women in terms of raising their children as Jews, because the husbands want them to be raised as Jews. Anyway, so I don't know how I even got onto this. Chicago. I don't know. I'll keep doing it. Okay, I'll remember. Maybe I'll remember how I got onto it. But so Chicago. So let me play just a clip of a deli in Chicago. First of all, does anyone remember Charles Kuralt? He had a show called On the Road that was very popular on CBS on Sunday morning. Sure. And he would travel all around the country and interview these very offbeat, eccentric, crazy people. And so he did a segment at this deli called Jerry's in Chicago, on Grand Avenue in Chicago.
It happens every day. Some innocent out-of-towner finds himself on Grand Avenue at noontime, wants a nice, quiet lunch, and decides he'll have it at Jerry's place.
One of you move! Don't stand there looking! Down there, man! Down there, you're sir, up there. Up there, sir. Walk, sir, come with me. Come with me, sir. This is it. Right here. There's a man. Wake up!
And that is the worst mistake that out-of-towner could possibly make. Between 11:30 and 1 o'clock, Jerry's is not so much a delicatessen as a crucible, in which office girls and hard hats and newspaper men and hippies and cops are crushed and insulted and manhandled, and only the strong survive.
Down there! Down there! Get up! I don't care which!
You have to have some kind of death wish to go through this for a corned beef sandwich.
Come with me! Get this stuff? Yes! What do I owe you? Here we are! Tell me what you want! Give me a roast beef!
The Lucifer of this inferno is Jerry Myers. His incredible mixed bag of customers aver that to know him is to love him. And he is lovable, sure enough.
Shut up, Derek! Stop! Well, why don't you open your mouth? Well, say it, man!
It's just that indecision drives him crazy. Jerry Myers often throws indecisive customers out on the street. The well-trained ones steel themselves on the sidewalk, take a deep breath, and then hit the door ordering.
All right, come on, there he is!
Roast beef, lettuce, tomato, mayonnaise.
What kind of food he wants to know?
Roll. Corned beef.
Roast beef on a roll, lettuce, tomato, mayonnaise.
A battalion of hot-eyed countermen trained by the master support Jerry and compliment him.
Yours, sir, yours! Down here, please!
But he is the impresario, and it's no good staying in your office and trying an end run to the hot pastrami, because he answers the phones, too.
Jerry's, go ahead, please. Go ahead, ma'am, please. That's all right, ma'am. There's 4 phones ringing. Talk fast, please. What else, ma'am? What else, ma'am? Extension number. It's been nice.
Jerry's son, Michael, wrote an essay for school once which said, "I admire one person very much. That person is my father. I want to be like him. He likes black and white the same. He is nice and kind to all people."
Because I love you.
Do you really get mad at customers sometimes?
No, not mad in the sense of mad, no. It's mad in the sense that I must see them taken care of immediately. Our rule is if they're here after 3 minutes, they get their merchandise for nothing. This has been my rule for 25 years. I've never given anything away yet. I think there's a person actually feels something, that there is a love of fellow man in there somewhere, even when I shout at him, even when I grab him by the hand. I think there is that a person actually knows it. Sure, the few individuals that say, "the hell with you," I've had them swear at me and run out. They don't want to take this, but those are the very few. I think people really know these things.
Walk faster. Leave room for somebody else.
My father, wrote Jerry's son Mike, yells at the customer. But his store is the most integrated store in the world. It is a strange store.
Papa! Almost lost him. Sir, you want to give your order or you want to stand there? Forget about it. Go to
Mike, my boy, you said a mouthful.
All right, so a little bit of a trip down memory lane there, um, literally, I guess, on the road. Um, there was he was a very beloved journalist, but I think maybe slightly less beloved when it came out that all this time that he was traveling on the road, he actually had a whole other family that his wife and children didn't know about. And I think that was it was hard for people to see him quite the same way after that. But anyway, he did do some wonderful work with these interviews. All right, so let's keep moving. I wish I could talk more about Chicago, but and there is so much to talk about with Chicago. This is Manny's coffee shop, which is basically a deli in Chicago. Okay, so World War II is actually really important in the history of the deli because partly because of this sort of phenomenon of a family sending salamis to their service. Send a salami to your boy in the army. Those of you who are from New York know that it's this doesn't rhyme unless you say it with a like my grandparents kind of outer borough New York accent. Send a salami to your boy in the army. But also, Jewish GIs were discovering other, I mean, many of them grew up kosher, grew up eating only, traditional Jewish foods, and they're in the South Pacific or whatever, and suddenly they're eating ham for Uncle Sam, right? And so they're sharing their food with their platoon mates, but they're also finding out about other food, and they come back from the war, and a lot of them, really want to branch out in terms of what they're eating, and but also there's a very, I mean, what I think is inescapable kind of erotic undertone to this, right? It's a very phallic kind of symbol. And then after the war, there's a lot of very sexually suggestive advertising that that Hebrew National does, and that Zion Kosher, which is Hebrew National's main competitor in New York, does. So that's kind of a whole other thing that we could explore tonight. And maybe we will. I mean, if Rabbi Cohen says it's okay, maybe we'll end in a few minutes with that very famous scene from When Harry Met Sally. So there are connections all through this. So, but let me just say that after the war, things changed very radically in terms of. I mean, there are a lot of changes just in American society. I mean, the 1950s kind of Leave It to Beaver kitchens, right, with up-to-date refrigerators and freezers, and the more processed food is in this era, the better it's seen. The more space age, a lot of technologies developed during wartime, right, for preserving food. So it's like you want food that's you're taking out of the freezer, kind of thing. And let's play this.
A transcription.
For that old-fashioned flavor that all the folks favor, try Hebrew National Meats. They're a treat to be sure, 'cause the beef is so pure in Hebrew National Meats. You'll find corned beef and roast beef, salami, pastrami, and wonderful frankfurters too. They are surely delicious and purely nutritious, those Hebrew National Meats.
So very much trying to reach out beyond just the Jewish clientele, right? They haven't developed the slogan about answering to a higher authority yet, even though it says it here. But the song, in the era of the song, that hadn't come to them yet. But still, this idea that like this is food that should appeal to everybody. It's sanitary. It's whatever. Like a lot of deli food had kind of unsavory associations, like food that's made in dark basements, away from the light of day. Who knows what's happening, whatever down there, kind of thing. And so a lot of marketing, even in the earlier decades of the 20th century, like white, people working in deli should all wear white, and they should really emphasize how clean the food is, and whatever. You have a similar kind of thing that's going on here in the 50s. And also you have, right, like, I mean, deli food's being sold in, not so much in delis anymore as Jews are moving to the suburbs, but increasingly being sold in supermarkets. And again, these technologies that were developed during the war, the sort of freeze drying and shrink wrapping and all that kind of thing, which is very ironic because, I mean, we haven't mentioned this, but like the whole idea of soaking, of salting and curing and pickling or whatever meat is like originally from ancient times to preserve it, right? And now it's being like re-preserved in plastic for a new generation of suburbanites. So this is one of my eBay finds. I'm assuming it's like the card that the salesman would bring to the supermarket to show the deli counter guy that, all the different possibilities. All right, so we're going to keep moving here. Another thing is that, in this period, delis are making probably a third of their income on takeout, a third on people eating in the restaurant, and a third on catering. So, shivas and even weddings, bar mitzvahs, right? I mean, in that period, that was great, totally acceptable. That you would that's what people did. That's how they would order these round trays from delis with the little toothpicks with the little colored plastic things, whatever. All right, Florida, for those of you who I don't know, South Florida, um, Wolfie's, Rascal House, places in Miami Beach, and so on. This is Boston, where the politicians would hang out. JFK himself had to be photographed. Right. This is another thing about delis, that like the deli was the place where politicians would go to be able to shake hands, and sort of win the Jewish vote. So the G&G on Blue Hill Avenue in Boston was where like every politician, whether Jewish or not, including JFK, had to sort of be seen, like pressing the flesh, so to speak. And they would make a big bandstand on election day, and they would announce the return and all that kind of thing. This is Brookline, which is also a neighborhood of Boston. Okay, and LA, Cantor's on Fairfax Avenue, which I imagine some of you have been to, and Nate and Alice in Beverly Hills, right? So really iconic delis that serve the film industry in the same way as I was saying in New York, where they serve the theater industry and at that time the film industry as well. Okay, so Alan Sherman. Have we played any Alan Sherman yet? No. Alan Sherman is one of my favorites. Alan Sherman, also Chicago, grew up in Chicago and LA with a lot of moving back and forth. Went to like 14 schools or whatever by the time he was 18 years old. Parents, his whole family situation was incredibly chaotic and crazy, and that may have somehow filtered into his music and his whole sensibility. But I'll play maybe just the beginning of this. So what I want to emphasize is that by the 60s, when Sherman was at his height, there are all these other different ethnic cuisines that are kind of, being introduced to American society. By the late 60s, the end of the Asian Exclusion Act means that there are a lot of Asian immigrants who come to the United States. And I mean, for me, certainly growing up in New York, like Chinese food was like that. This was like really the New York Jewish food was really Chinese food, even more than delis to a certain extent. That's where Jews would get together. Obviously on Christmas Eve, but not just on Christmas Eve, on Sundays and whatever. And I actually called up the librarian once at the Great Neck Library, and I said, look, I want to try to figure out like what was more numerous, Jewish delis or Chinese restaurants. And we went through all kinds of old phone books and stuff like that, and we weren't able to find anything that conclusive. But my wife, who grew up in Merrick on the South Shore of Long Island, my mother-in-law tells a story of how they would go to the Chinese restaurant, and the Chinese restaurant would have like little plaques almost on each of the banquettes with the name of the Jewish family that would eat there. It was like, like going to the hospital or whatever and seeing all the names that are named after the Jewish donors, whatever. It was the Chinese restaurant. All right, I'm going to run out of time if I keep talking like this. All right, this might take a second.
If you like Hungarian food, they have a goulash, which is very good. Or if you wish a dish that's Chinese, somewhere down in column B, there's lobster Cantonese. Enchiladas, that's what people eat in Mexico. Shish kebab is skewered in Armenia, Then there's blubber, the favorite of the frigid Eskimo. Such delicious dishes, no matter where you go. Chicken cacciatore is Italian. Kangaroo souffle must be Australian. Mutton chops are definitely British. Chicken soup undoubtedly is Yiddish. Pumpernickel comes from Lithuania. Sun, fair, fur, comes from Pennsylvania.
All right, I just wanted to get the Pennsylvania reference in there. That's just because of Rabbi Cohen and I having this connection through Pennsylvania. But yeah, I mean, there's all these different ethnic foods that are becoming popular. And so Jews are not so interested in deli anymore, right? And particularly, as I mentioned, Chinese food. And Bernstein on Essex was the first restaurant that combined, that like started selling kosher Chinese food as well as deli. And they had waiters with tasseled skull caps. First it was like one night a week, and then it was every night a week they were serving Chinese food in addition to deli sandwiches. Here, I don't know if you can see it, but this was in Brooklyn, kosher deli in Brooklyn, where it says Lulu's famous chow mein on a bun. So 20 cents. Okay, this is, I promise. Do I have time, Phil, how much time do I have?
Yeah, there's people, take a couple more minutes. Go ahead. This is interesting.
All right, this is Shelley Posen, who I mentioned earlier, I think. Oh no, his album covers actually shows him in a deli, but I don't have that in this version of the presentation. But anyway, what's the main reason why Jews actually start to move away from the connection to deli, to the connection to these foods is what? Somebody tell me. It's obvious. What's the main reason why Jews start to sort of abandon delis? What's the problem? Assimilation, but also what? What's the problem with deli food?
Health reasons?
Health. Who said that? Laura?
I used to feel so guilty when sitting down to dine about how much I like to eat and where my tastes incline. But lately I have realized as I pile my plate with food that given where I'm coming from, I'm eating as I should. For if the good Lord had meant Jews to eat healthy food, he would never have given us kishka. He'd have given us tofu like they eat in Japan. He'd have made rusks and dulse part of our diet plan. He'd have never allowed us salami, chopped liver, corned beef, or pastrami. If God had meant Jews to have healthy insides, he would never have made us eat matzah. On Passover, we'd eat granola instead. Or, come to that, he just let us eat bread. As it is, we go all out of kilter by dining on fish that's gefilter. If the Kadosh Baruch Hu had meant Jews to eat right, we'd have never found out about flunkin'. We'd have had chicken soup and a noodle or two. But knishes, forget it, they'd be strictly taboo. And we'd never have grown to adults if as children our tongues had touched schmaltz. If Jews had been meant to be athletes and jocks, we'd have never been tempted by kugel. We'd have just eaten yogurt and crispy rice cakes, and for breakfast some fruit with dry toast or bran flakes, and we'd all spend the night in detox just for eating cream cheese with our locks. Now none of these arguments works on my dad, who eternally hawks me a chinik, saying, son, you are digging your grave with your teeth, and we'll have to sit shiver when you're underneath. This is not just an old cucker fibbin'. That's what happens to those who fress gribben.
All right, did I need to explain anything? What about hawking a chinik? Does people know what that means? What does that mean? Who can translate? For the Yiddish impaired among us.
Hitting me in the head.
You gotta be crazy.
Well, hawk mir nicht kein chinik literally means don't bang on my teapot.
On my tea, really?
Tea kettle. Yeah. Yeah. But it means don't annoy me. Don't, drive me crazy, that kind of thing. Okay. So, all right. I don't really, I'm reluctant to take up too much more time, but I don't know. Should I?
Take the time.
Of these that some of you may remember on Saturday Night Live with John Belushi, where he does, like there's Samurai Tailor, there's Samurai Night Fervor, there's Samurai Psychiatrist, Samurai Dry Cleaner. But this of course is my favorite. But there's a lot going on. I mean, it's really interesting in many ways in terms of a lot of what we've talked about, like this whole thing that I talked about, like in the delis of New York, where the deli owner was or the waiter or whatever was like, or kind of a threatening presence in some ways. And here you have this crazy homicidal, suicidal, guy behind the counter, and the deli's really become a dangerous place, right? Because if the food doesn't get you right because it's so unhealthy, and he keeps saying trim away the fat, like I don't want it to be that unhealthy, then the guy behind the counter will. Which actually, I mean, if you think about it, this is not actually sort of in popular culture. This is not the best example of the hostile guy behind the counter. That would be, what would that be? What's the episode of Seinfeld, which
The soup Nazi.
Soup Nazi.
Right, exactly. So
Nazi.
what's funny here, I mean, what's ironic at least, is that as time goes on, I mean, I was saying earlier, like it used to be like almost like the customary, to have, say, a bar bat mitzvah or a wedding, and just serve sandwiches from the deli. Over time, as Jews become more like upwardly mobile and whatever, they stop serving deli at simchas, at smachot, and what becomes sort of like de rigueur at every Jewish simcha, it's not a deli sandwich, it's what, and maybe still is to some extent,
Eagles?
sushi, right? So maybe this guy is like the sushi, right? That's what he's going to become, right? Eventually, he's going to migrate from becoming the deli owner to becoming the sushi chef, right? Whatever, that kind of thing. All right. Anyway, but it's about health, right? It's about like how Jews are really, no longer, is it a kind of, socially acceptable in some ways, or I mean, certainly by the 1970s when that episode came out, that was 1976. Jews have embraced the whole health and fitness revolution in the United States. I mean, Jane Fonda is doing her workout videos, and Jim Fixx writes this book about about marathon running, right? And then he drops dead of a heart attack. But right? I mean, this is like what it means to be American, is to really care about your health and fitness. That starts in the 1970s, and deli food is incompatible with that. That notion that like that's what it means to truly be American. All right, I'm gonna end with this. Actually, I'm gonna play it not from here, but from it's too small there. I'm gonna play it from this. Okay, but I have to stop the share and then reshare, and then it should be good. Okay. Oh, and I have to do the sound again. Sorry. No.
No, we're not getting the sound.
Here. So why is it not sharing the sound? Share the sound. Oh, I see. It says it's sharing.
But on the video itself, the sound was turned all the way down. I don't know if that's the issue or something else.
Oh, that might be it. Yeah. Okay. Good. That might be it. Where's that? That's
Bottom left.
Of course not. You're out the door too fast.
I'll just technical a bit.
Morning and go clean your ass in the morning.
Early meeting, early haircut, early squash game.
You don't play squash.
They don't know that. They just met me.
That's disgusting.
I know. I feel terrible.
You know, I'm so glad I never got involved with you. I just would have ended up being some woman you had to get up out of bed and leave at 3 o'clock in the morning and go clean your andirons. And you don't even have a fireplace. Not that I would know this.
Why are you getting so upset? This is not about you.
Yes, it is. You are a human affront to all women, and I am a woman.
Hey, I don't feel great about this, but I don't hear anyone complaining.
Of course not. You're out the door too fast.
I think they have an okay time.
How do you know?
I mean, how do I know? I know.
Because they
Yes, because they...
How do you know that they're really?
What are you saying? That they fake orgasm?
It's possible.
Get out of here.
Why? Most women at one time or another have faked it.
Well, they haven't faked it with me.
How do you know?
Because I know.
Oh. Right. That's right. I forgot. You're a man.
What is that supposed to mean?
Nothing. It's just that all men are sure it never happened to them, and most women at one time or another have done it, so you do the math.
You don't think that I could tell a difference?
No.
Get out of here.
Oh. Ooh.
Are you okay?
Oh. Oh, God. Ooh. Oh, God. Oh. 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 Oh, God. Oh, yeah, right there. Oh. 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 Oh, God. Oh. Yes. 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 Ah. Oh. Oh, yes. 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 Oh. Yes. 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 Oh. 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 Oh, God. Oh.
I'll have what she's having.
Okay, so that of course is Estelle Reiner, Rob Reiner's mother, the director of this 1989 film. And so this is like, in some ways, I think it does bring together a lot of things that we've talked about. I mean, there is something about the space of the deli that, both Jews and non-Jews clearly respond to. In this case, it's the non-Jewish character who is having the most ecstatic sort of, I mean, I know it's histrionic, right? But still, experience of the deli. And there seems to be something about this kind of Lower East Side milieu, right? I mean, my I know my because my mother tells stories about like just there was not a lot of privacy in these apartments, when Jews were living in this neighborhood. So children ended up, sometimes children actually lived in their parents' bedroom for longer than we would probably be comfortable these days, or they would hear things and see things that they don't tend to necessarily see and hear in person these days. And but something about the space of the deli, a Yiddish culture, the humor, the salamis hanging from the ceiling, right? All that phallic imagery I was talking about earlier. There is this sort of erotic undertone to it, and she really kind of connects to it in a very powerful way. And the fact that it's a non-Jewish character, I think, is really particularly interesting because I think as time has gone on, I mean, certainly the deli owners who I've talked to in the last 10 or 15 years have told me, I mean, the newer delis that have sort of sprung up across the country that tend to be much more 21st century in terms of their like being artisanal and, like the small portions and grass-fed beef and like organic vegetables, and homemade sodas, none of the like Dr. Brown's or the whatever, right? And when you say like, who are your customers? They say, do you have mostly Jewish customers? They say, no, of course not. I have mostly non-Jewish customers. So it makes me wonder sometimes if maybe the future of Jewish culture is increasingly in the hands of people who are not Jewish, but who, or for whatever reason, are drawn to explore something that may or may not be familiar to them, but that they take pleasure in. And I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means for the future of Jewish life. And again, as I said at the beginning, I don't think we have these kinds of spaces so much anymore. Outside of synagogues, definitely synagogues. But the problem is that the vast majority of American Jews don't belong to synagogues anymore. So, and JCCs, and some cultural things like Jewish film festivals and so on. But for the most part, these kinds of space Hillels, right? for the most part, these kinds of spaces don't really exist anymore, and certainly not in the way that they used to. Certainly not in the way that they can kind of unify the Jewish community, or bring people together in that way. So I don't know. And my children actually, when they think about Jewish food, like I don't think that they think about deli food as like, when you say like Jewish food, I don't think they think about this kind of food so much. I think that um, they're much more oriented towards Israel. They go to Jewish day school, they go to Jewish camps, or they did. And I think that falafel and hummus and whatever are sort of the Jewish foods of today for younger people, much more than like kishka, pastrami, or whatever. Anyway, I would love to hear, if we have time, I would love to hear people's thoughts about any of this. If any of it resonated with you, if you have any memories that you want to share with the group about growing up going to delis, or eating this kind of food, what it means to you.
Yeah. Uh, I, I have a lot of memories. I'm gonna just give you one, and hopefully people have
Well, I
other.
quoted one of yours in my book, actually. So,
Oh, I resent you that. I didn't really, you'd seen it. My story, Bronx Deli. It must have been from there. It's the only thing I ever wrote about the delis.
Bronx Deli,
Okay.
yeah.
But I lived in West Philadelphia for a few years, and the first year I moved there, I lived in a house with 3 other Jews. One of them was a Jewish. He was a third-year law student at Penn. This was right near the University of Pennsylvania, and further west used to be a Jewish neighborhood, but by whatever designated time period, most of the Jews moved over the county, over the line into the suburbs. But my friend, for some reason, had a nose. He just had a nose. He smelled out a delicatessen in what had long become a predominantly Black neighborhood. And we ate lunch there several times. And the clientele were mostly African Americans. It was really kind of funny, but it was authentically, it was the same deli you would expect in a not an African American neighborhood. It was really quite interesting.
So this is something I'm really particularly interested in, and I haven't seen it so much actually in New York, but in and I don't know as much about Philadelphia, but in Chicago, there's actually a really interesting example of a Jewish deli in the Maxwell Street area, which was the original area of immigration, or settlement of immigrants, that was a kosher deli for decades. And then when the owner retired, he sold it to one of his African American workers. And as the neighborhood became more and more of a Black neighborhood, it kind of became a hangout for the Black people in that neighborhood eating the Jewish foods. And we have that here in Baltimore. I mean, we have I don't know if any of you know Baltimore, but Baltimore, down by the Inner Harbor, there is a street called Lombard Street, which used to be Corned Beef Row because it had so many delis on it. There's only one deli left now. It's been there for 100 years. It's called Atman's, not kosher, and it's an entirely Black neighborhood. It still has the same Jewish family that owns it. In fact, the family that owns it is very prominent in my synagogue in the suburbs, the Atman family. And it's a really interesting experience going there for exactly what you were saying, Phil, about like this sort of convergence of cultures, in an interesting way. And I think the whole notion of soul food, like, is something that Black and Jewish people kind of share, like this idea of like really heavy, very kind of nurturing, fare. And we have here in the suburbs too, in Owings Mills, which is just north of Pikesville, there's a deli called Lenny's, which serves kind of equal quantities of corned beef sandwiches and fried chicken, macaroni and cheese. Is really a hangout for both Jews and Blacks in equal measure. And you don't see that so much in other places. So I think you're pointing to something very interesting, and I tried to get into that a little bit with that clip from Jerry's Deli with Charles Kuralt, the idea of the deli being this like space of integration. It's from the 70s, but this space of integration between Blacks and Jews. Okay. Other comments, questions?
Then I have a question.
He said,
So my grandfather used to talk for a little while in the maybe late 40s, early 50s. He ran what he called an appetizing store in New York, which I've always kind of imagined to be sort of the dairy version of a deli. Is Is that a fair assessment? I know that he, used to talk about pickles and coleslaw and, macaroni salad and all those kinds of things. Um, and I think my aunt is the only one who still has his coleslaw recipe that she makes. But did those kind of grow up in harmony with delis? Were they completely just not
They were
different world?
no, it's a really good question. So in New York, there were a number of different kinds of Jewish sort of eating establishments, right? And so there were delis that were focused on meat. There were dairy restaurants that, were obviously focused on dairy, and like blintzes and knishes and soups and kasha, that kind of thing. And the best example of that I mentioned very briefly, which was a place called Ratner's on Delancey Street on the Lower East Side. And then there were appetizing stores. And appetizers were sort of a whole other thing in some ways. Like the most famous appetizing store that's still there is called Russ and Daughters, which is on the Lower East Side. And then they have also in the Jewish Museum on Fifth Avenue. If anyone's been to the Jewish Museum, Russ and Daughters has a place in there. I think they might have one other. But basically like smoked fishes, like all different kinds of like lox and whitefish and so yeah, bagels, cream cheese, but halava. Does anyone know halava? That really crumbly candy. Love halava. I grew up eating that. I haven't seen it in actually a long time, but they must have it here somewhere.
They carry it in some of the grocery stores here.
Whoa.
It's Middle Eastern. Halava is really Middle Eastern. It's really not
Yeah,
Eastern
you have
European.
not been, you must have been to like the Shuk, or not
Jerusalem, yes.
not the Arab Shuk, but what's the neighborhood I'm thinking of? I mean, they have these stores with 20 different kinds of halva.
In Jerusalem.
Ben
Yeah,
Yehuda, yeah, Machane
Yehuda, and also the
yeah,
Carmel
of course.
market in
But I'm
Tel Aviv.
talking about like here, like I'm like in Baltimore. I don't know where.
It's
Yeah, in Israel. Oh
it's
yeah.
Here
it has
it's packaged in grocery stores,
Yeah.
like a candy bar. You can
Right,
find it
but
like that.
if you go to the
Right.
Middle Eastern markets in Riverside, there's lots of halva and it's not in packages.
Oh,
Okay.
that's good.
So you all have your marching orders.
Didn't know that.
That's your homework. You got your homework. You got to find some halva. And they have different flavors, right? It's all different flavors, just like Jerusalem and everything like that. Okay, so how do we get onto this? Oh, appetizing stores. And then there were cafeterias. There were like these big, like for the garment workers in the 30s, below Times Square. There were these Jewish cafeterias. So you had all different kinds of, and then there were the automats. There was a documentary that came out recently about Horn and Hardart, the automats, where you would have the vending machine type of thing, where you would like put in the money and then the window would open and whatever would come out, the apple pie or the sandwich or the whatever. So there was a whole range of different things that really don't exist anymore. I mean, really, none of them exist anymore because the delis have almost all faded out. The dairy restaurants are gone for a long time. The cafeterias are definitely gone, and the appetizing stores, as I said, there are one or two left, and that's really it. One place that's sort of like a combination of a few of these things, I would say, is a place called Barney Greengrass on Amsterdam Avenue and 80 something street. If you go
Sturgeon King.
yes, if you ever come to New York, I really recommend going there because they have it's not a deli, but they have really good like omelets and bagels and all this kind of stuff, appetizing kinds of things like you're saying. All right, other questions?
So why do you think that the delis died out?
I think there are really a number of reasons. I think that a couple of them I mentioned, in terms of like, health consciousness and in terms of people discovering other ethnic cuisines. But there are other reasons that I didn't mention. I mean, one of them has to do with this whole theme that I've talked a lot about tonight as far as kind of social class and upward mobility. And the children of deli owners did not want to go into this business. I mean, it's really, really hard work. I mean, really long days, really kind of, it's physically very demanding. If you think about just, the process of having to cure these meats, these big sides of beef, these huge slabs of brisket basically that had to be schlepped, up and down the stairs to the barrels in the basement. And just like running a mom and pop business, I mean, having to get up early every morning and start cooking and preparing everything. And, it was really kind of a 7-day a week thing. I mean, people assume that because, a lot of these delis were kosher, particularly in the outer boroughs in Brooklyn and in the Bronx. 1930s, there were 1,550 kosher delis in the 5 boroughs of New York alone. In the 30s, at the height of the Depression, right, 1,550 kosher delis. But as Jews became, after World War II, really, right, as Jews became, had more opportunities to go to elite colleges and to go to medical school and law school and business school and become more successful. They didn't want their children to go into this business, and their children didn't want to go into it either. There's actually a really great comedy clip by Shelley Berman, famous Jewish comedian who played Larry David's father on Curb Your Enthusiasm. An early comedy routine he did in which he's talking on the phone to his father, who's a deli owner in Chicago, and he's talking about how he doesn't want to go into the business. He wants to be an actor. He wants to go to New York and take acting lessons. And the father's like, "That's crazy. You're not going to make a living as an actor and whatever." So and also, I mean, there's a great song by Mickey Katz. If anybody remembers Mickey Katz, there's a great song called 16 Tons, which is based on a Tennessee Ernie Ford classic song about coal mining, 16 tons of coal. But Mickey Katz makes it into a song about working in a deli, and and all the work that goes into it. He gets a hernia and whatever, and he can't take it. So so I think that's a big reason. And then also, I mean, in terms of the reason why a lot of these delis in New York in particular have closed is just like, I mean, particularly like in Midtown, the really famous delis that, must have, were very successful for decades and decades. But, it's just, there's not a huge profit margin on sandwiches.
Yeah,
And it's not like they made a lot of money on, like if that's your bread and butter, no pun intended, whatever. But, like soup and sandwiches and whatever, like you're in Times Square and you're paying $1 million a month or whatever for rent. Like you just can't do that. It just doesn't work, and if the delis didn't own their own buildings, if the deli owners didn't own the buildings, but they were renting their space, then eventually it's just, I mean, the price of meat also has gone up tremendously over time, like really skyrocketed. So, it just became a business that just wasn't viable anymore.
Yeah, I just looked up Barney Greengrass, and
Right.
a pound of pastrami is $46.
Oh my gosh.
But
So,
and it wasn't that long ago. It actually was a while back. We had lunch at Katz's, which still thrives, but there aren't any Jewish countermen left. They're all Hispanic and black. And I seem to remember hearing something about the last Jewish counterman at Katz's, or the drug. It was
about that, and I think that that's actually important because it does change the experience of eating in a deli when when the people who are working there or working behind the counter or serving the food or whatever aren't you. I mean, there are funny examples of people who working in in delis in New York where they kind of like take on all these Jewish characteristics or whatever just from the fact of kind of working there. There's a really funny one from the Carnegie Deli, where this Irish waitress, these people don't give her a tip or whatever, and she's like running out to the street and screaming at them or whatever. It's like a comedy, but still, it's like like it makes you wonder if like people who work in these places sort of absorb some of the shtick. But as time goes on, there's less and less of that shtick to absorb, and it's just not the same experience going to these places.
I'll do first of all, I think it's maybe need to wrap it up, but I'll do you a favor. In 15 months or 14 and a half months when I retire, I'll retire to the Lower East Side to see my people, and I'll get a job in Katz's. So I'll be behind the counter and I'll start yelling at the people.
Okay,
And I'll send you an email.
Okay, good.
One quick question, may I?
Please, Ronald.
The fact of having the pickles and the sauerkraut on the table, tradition across the board, all the delis always? And what's your thought on that?
So, so when you say pickles and sauerkraut, so my sort of, like my experience has been mostly like pickles and coleslaw,
Meaning, yeah.
not sauerkraut per se. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about that. I've thought about that. I've been asked about that, and I don't actually know when that started or whether that's something that was universal. But it is sort of an interesting custom and a little bit counterintuitive because you would think like you want people to be as hungry as possible and to order as much food as possible. And you're sort of taking the edge off of their hunger by doing that. On the other hand, it feels very Jewish, it's like feels very English to be like feeding people even before they've ordered anything. Type of thing. It's a Vorspeise, right? It's an appetizer. It's supposed to, to some extent like get you your juices going a little bit, right? So but I don't know when that started exactly, if that's something that how far back that goes. I would doubt it. No, I don't know. I was gonna say I doubt it goes too far back. I'm not sure.
Mhm.
All right, so people are starting to drop off. It's late, and it's late by you. It's 3 hours later by you. So thank you very much.
But I can go on. I can go on all night. So
Thanks a lot.
Wait, is this?
Yeah.
Wait, Phil. Is this? Wait, this is Shavuot. I thought this was we don't do that on Pesach. A Tikkun Leil Pesach.
No,
Stay up
we'll
night
we'll bring you back for Shabbat. We're going to do the very first tikkun this temple's ever had. So you come back and
Really? I didn't know that. But this was not arranged between us, right? I didn't just make that joke because I knew about that. I'm just learning about that
it's all right.
right now.
So anyway, thank you all for coming. People, it's getting late for folks here.
Thank you for coming, Chad. That was really fun.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Looking where I can get kishka.
Exactly. Happy
Yeah, thanks a
Passover,
lot.
everyone. Moedim l'simcha.
We're paying you in salamis, by the way. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All
All
right,
right.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Right on.
Everybody.
Good night.